On a foggy morning along the Oregon coast, 8-year-old Emma screamed as she watched an old man slip beneath the dark waves. In that terrifying moment, her golden retriever Max became a hero, diving into the freezing water to save a complete stranger's life. What Emma didn't know was that her beloved dog had just rescued one of the richest men in America, tech billionaire Charles Wentworth. But money meant nothing when Charles was drowning. What saved him wasn't his fortune, but the pure heart of a little girl's dog. That rescue changed Charles forever. He abandoned his isolated mansion and moved to Emma's small town, determined to discover what real wealth looked like. But what happens when a man who owned everything finally learns what it means to truly live? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The salt water burned Charles Wentworth's lungs as he coughed violently on the rocky shore, his designer suit clinging to his 76-year-old frame like a second skin. The waterlogged Rolex on his wrist had stopped at 7:23 a.m., the exact moment his old life ended, though he didn't know it yet. Above him, a little girl with sand-colored braids knelt beside a massive golden retriever whose amber eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost human. "Are you okay, mister?" Emma's voice carried the genuine concern of a child who hadn't yet learned that strangers could be dangerous. Her small hands pressed a faded beach towel against his shoulders, while Max shook seawater from his golden coat, tail wagging despite the drama of the rescue. Charles tried to speak, but only managed another coughing fit. In 53 years of building a tech empire worth $12 billion, he had never felt so helpless. The irony wasn't lost on him. All his wealth, all his power, all his carefully constructed barriers between himself and the world. And it took an 8-year-old girl and her dog to save his life. "Emma, Emma, where are you?" An older woman's voice carried across the morning fog, tinged with worry. "Over here, Grandma Martha. Max saved someone," Emma called back, never taking her bright blue eyes off Charles's face. There was something in her gaze that unsettled him, not suspicion or calculation, but simple human kindness. When was the last time someone had looked at him that way? Martha Clearwater appeared through the mist like something from a Norman Rockwell painting. She was perhaps 70, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, and hands that spoke of a lifetime of caring for others. Her assessment of the situation was immediate and thorough. "Good heavens," she murmured, dropping to her knees beside Charles. "Emma, run back to the cottage and bring the big wool blanket from the living room. And put the kettle on, this gentleman needs something warm." She turned to Charles with the no-nonsense authority of someone who had raised children and buried a husband. "Can you sit up? We need to get you out of these wet clothes before you catch pneumonia." Charles nodded weakly, accepting Martha's steadying hand as he struggled to a sitting position. The Pacific Northwest coast stretched endlessly in both directions, wild and beautiful in a way his penthouse views had never captured. He had come to Oregon to finalize the purchase of a coastal resort development, another acquisition to add to his portfolio. Instead, he had nearly become a statistic. "I'm Charles," he said, his voice rough from seawater. He almost added his last name out of habit, then stopped himself. Charles Wentworth was a name that opened doors and ended conversations. Here, with sand between his fingers and genuine concern in a stranger's eyes, he wanted to be just Charles. "Charlie," he corrected himself, surprised by the decision. "Martha Clearwater," she replied, helping him to his feet. "That's my granddaughter, Emma, and you've already met our hero Max. This old boy's saved 3 people from these waters over the years, but he's never looked prouder than he does right now." Max padded closer, pressing his wet flank against Charles's leg. The dog's body radiated warmth and something else, an acceptance so complete it took Charles's breath away. When had anyone, human or animal, ever looked at him without wanting something in return? Emma returned with the blanket, chattering excitedly about Max's rescue technique. He saw you go under and didn't even hesitate. Grandma says Max has special instincts about people who need help. He knew you were good, I can tell. Good. The word hit Charles like a physical blow. When had anyone called him good? Successful. Yes. Ruthless, certainly. A visionary, according to Fortune magazine. But good? Not since his son Michael was small, before everything went wrong. Martha's cottage sat just beyond the dunes, painted yellow with white shutters, and a garden that spoke of patient tending rather than professional landscaping. Inside, everything was clean and comfortable without being ostentatious. Hand-knitted throws draped over well-worn furniture. Photographs of family covered every surface, and the smell of something cinnamon baking in the oven made the space feel like a warm embrace. The guest bathroom's through there, Martha said, handing Charles dry clothes that clearly belonged to a much larger man. Those were my Harold's. He'd be about your size, I think. Her voice carried no sadness, just the practical kindness of someone who had learned to transform grief into grace. In the privacy of the bathroom, Charles caught his reflection in the medicine cabinet mirror. His silver hair, usually perfectly styled, hung in damp strings around a face that looked older than his 76 years. When had the lines around his eyes become so deep? When had his shoulders begun to curve inward, as if carrying an invisible weight? Harold's clothes fit reasonably well, a faded flannel shirt and warm corduroys that smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and wood polish. Charles couldn't remember the last time he had worn anything that wasn't tailored specifically for him. The informality felt like stepping into someone else's life. When he emerged, Emma was setting the small kitchen table for three, carefully placing mismatched plates and cloth napkins with the seriousness of a diplomat arranging a peace treaty. Max had claimed a spot by the fireplace, chin resting on his paws but eyes alert and watching. "I hope you don't mind scrambled eggs and toast," Martha said, bustling around the kitchen with practiced efficiency. "I wasn't expecting company, but Emma insists we treat rescues properly. She says Max always gets extra treats when he saves. So guests should get a proper meal." "You don't need to," Charles began, but Martha silenced him with a look. "Young man, you merely drowned in my backyard. The least I can do is make sure you don't faint from hunger on my watch." She paused, spatula in hand. "Unless you need to get somewhere?" Someone must be worried about you. The question hung in the air like morning fog. Someone worried about him? His assistant would eventually notice his absence, but only because it would disrupt carefully scheduled meetings. His board members would wonder where he was, but only because his decisions affected their profit margins. His ex-wife lived in Switzerland now, their relationship reduced to polite holiday cards. And Michael had been gone for 3 years, killed in a car accident at 28. Their relationship never repaired after years of Charles choosing work over family. "No," Charles said quietly. "No one's waiting for me." Emma looked up from her careful napkin folding, her young face serious. "That's sad. Everyone should have someone who worries about them. But don't be sad, Max worries about everyone. That's his job." Martha's breakfast was simple, but perfect eggs fluffy with butter, toast made from bread that tasted homemade, and coffee strong enough to chase away the last of the ocean's chill. Charles couldn't remember the last time he had eaten something that wasn't prepared by a professional chef or served at a business meeting. This felt different. This felt like being cared for rather than simply served. "So what brings you to Seaside?" "Harbor, Charlie?" Martha asked, refilling his coffee cup. "We don't get many visitors this time of year." Charles hesitated. The truth was complicated. He was here to evaluate a property acquisition that would eventually price most locals out of their hometown. The development company had promised luxury amenities and economic growth, but Charles had built enough resorts to know what really happened. Small communities like this became playgrounds for the wealthy, their authentic character polished away until nothing remained but expensive charm. "Business," he said finally. "But I'm not sure it matters anymore." "The drowning changed your mind?" Martha's question was gentle but direct, something like that. Charles watched Emma feeding Max small pieces of toast, the girl's face bright with uncomplicated joy. "I've spent most of my life focused on things that seemed important at the time. This morning made me wonder if I've been looking in the wrong direction." Martha nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Harold used to say that near-death experiences were just God's way of making us pay attention." Said it happened to him twice, once in Vietnam, once when his fishing boat capsized in a storm. Both times made him a better man, according to him. Was he right? Harold was right about most things. Martha smiled. "Took me 43 years of marriage to admit it, but yes, he was usually right, especially about what matters." After breakfast, Emma insisted on showing Charles around Seaside Harbor. The town was small enough to walk end to end in 20 minutes. Its streets lined with weathered houses that spoke of generations of families choosing to stay rather than chase opportunities elsewhere. The harbor itself, perhaps 30 fishing boats, most showing the honest wear of working vessels rather than pleasure craft. "That's Captain Pete's boat," Emma explained, pointing to a blue-hulled vessel named Second Chance. "He teaches kids how to fish every summer. And that's where Mrs. Henderson sells the best clam chowder in Oregon. She says so herself." "Oh, and that's the animal shelter where Max came from." The Seaside Harbor Animal Shelter sat at the edge of town, a converted barn painted cheerful yellow, with kennels visible through large windows. A hand-painted sign proclaimed, "Every animal deserves love," in rainbow letters that had clearly been crafted by children. "Max lived there for almost a year before we found him," Emma continued. "Sarah, she runs the shelter, says Max was waiting for the right family, but I think he was waiting for the right job. Saving people is definitely his job." As they walked back toward Martha's cottage, Charles found himself noticing details his usual focus on efficiency would have missed. The way morning light painted the weathered buildings in shades of gold and amber. The sound of genuine laughter coming from the elementary school playground. The sight of neighbors pausing their morning routines to exchange more than perfunctory greetings. When had he last lived in a place where people knew each other's names? That evening, Martha invited Charles to stay for dinner, explaining that the nearest hotel was 30 miles away and the roads could be treacherous in the fog. He accepted, telling himself it was practical rather than acknowledging how much he dreaded returning to his sterile, empty world. Over Martha's pot roast, another simple meal that somehow felt like a celebration, Emma peppered him with questions about his life. Charles found himself editing carefully, talking about traveling for work without mentioning private jets, describing business meetings without revealing the amounts of money involved. "Do you have any kids?" Emma asked, and Charles felt the familiar tightness in his chest. "I had a son," he said quietly. "He died a few years ago." Emma's eyes filled with immediate tears. "I'm sorry. That must be the saddest thing in the world." "It is," Charles admitted, surprised by his honesty. Martha reached across the table to squeeze his hand. "I'm sorry for your loss. Losing a child, there's no preparing for that kind of pain." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. 3 generations connected by the simple acknowledgement of grief. Charles couldn't remember the last time anyone had offered him genuine sympathy, rather than careful condolences designed not to intrude on his privacy. That night, lying in Martha's guest room under a quilt that smelled of lavender and sea air, Charles stared at the ceiling and made a decision that would have stunned his board of directors. He pulled out his phone and called his assistant. "Rebecca?" It's Charles. Cancel everything for the next week. Maybe longer. Sir, the Morrison acquisition meeting is tomorrow, and the quarterly reports. Handle it, or delegate it. I don't care. Charles listened to the shocked silence on the other end. And Rebecca? If anyone asks where I am, tell them I'm learning what I should have learned a long time ago. He ended the call and turned off the phone, feeling lighter than he had in years. Outside his window, he could hear the eternal rhythm of waves against shore, and somewhere in the cottage, Max's gentle snoring provided a counterpoint of peace. For the first time in decades, Charles Wentworth fell asleep without reviewing profit margins or planning tomorrow's conquests. Instead, he dreamed of golden fur and bright blue eyes, of hands that offered help without expecting anything in return, and of a little girl who believed everyone deserved someone to worry about them. When morning came, Charles made the second decision that would change everything. He was going to stay in Seaside Harbor long enough to understand what he had been missing all these years. The resort development could wait. The board meetings could wait. Everything could wait while he learned what it meant to be rescued by something other than money. Charles woke to the sound of Emma's laughter drifting through the guest room window. She was in the backyard with Max, throwing a tennis ball that the golden retriever caught with the precision of an outfielder. The simple joy in her voice made something tighten in Charles's chest, a reminder of mornings with Michael, before success became more important than Saturday baseball games. Over Martha's pancakes and fresh strawberries, Charles found himself reluctant to discuss his plans for the day. The truth was, he had no plans beyond postponing his return to Seattle indefinitely. For a man whose calendar was typically scheduled in 15-minute increments 6 months in advance, the freedom felt both liberating and terrifying. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need," Martha said, reading his hesitation with the intuition of someone who had spent decades caring for people. "The guest room doesn't get much use, and Emma's already planning to show you the tide pools this afternoon. I couldn't impose." "Charlie," Martha's voice carried gentle authority, "you nearly died yesterday morning. Your body needs time to recover, and frankly, your spirit looks like it could use some tending too. There's no shame in accepting help when it's offered freely." After breakfast, Charles walked into town with a purpose that surprised him. He rented a small cottage on Driftwood Lane, a weathered blue house with white trim that sat 3 blocks from the harbor. The monthly rate was less than he typically spent on wine and business dinners, but he paid in cash to avoid questions about credit checks or references. The cottage came furnished with pieces that looked like they had been collected over decades rather than purchased in a single shopping trip. A comfortable sofa faced windows that framed the harbor. Built-in bookshelves held volumes with cracked spines and margin notes, and the kitchen featured a gas stove that required matches to light but promised to cook with the reliability of something made to last. His next stop was the cellular store, where he purchased a basic phone under the name Charles Walker, close enough to his real identity to feel familiar, but anonymous enough to provide the breathing space he desperately needed. He transferred only essential contacts, deliberately leaving behind the dozens of numbers that represented obligation rather than connection. Rebecca, his assistant, answered on the first ring. "Mr. Wentworth, thank goodness. Legal needs your signature on the Morrison contracts, and the board is asking questions about your absence. Tell legal to handle it however they see fit," Charles said, staring out the cottage window at fishing boats heading out for the day's work. "And tell the board that I'm taking some personal time. Long overdue personal time. Sir, with respect, you've never taken personal time. Not in the 15 years I've worked for you. Is everything all right?" Charles considered the question seriously. Was everything all right? Yesterday morning, he had been a lonely billionaire focused on acquiring another property he didn't need. Today he was Charles Walker, renting a modest cottage in a town where his greatest achievement was surviving a near drowning. By most measures, nothing was all right. "Everything's exactly as it should be," he said finally. "Forward any true emergencies." To my personal email, but Rebecca defined emergency very carefully. "I'm not available for routine business." After ending the call, Charles sat in the cottage's kitchen silence and made a list of how he wanted to spend his days. Not a business plan or acquisition strategy, but something he hadn't done since childhood. A list of things he actually wanted to do. Visit the animal shelter. Learn the names of people he met. Take long walks without checking his phone. Help with something that mattered to someone else. The list looked pathetic compared to his usual daily agenda of merger talks and profit maximization. But it also looked like the first honest document he had written in years. The seaside harbor. Animal shelter occupied a converted barn that had been transformed with more love than money. Inside, the air hummed with the sounds of animals waiting for their second chances. Dogs barking hopefully at every visitor. Cats purring from sunny windows, and the occasional exotic rescue that someone had surrendered when reality met responsibility. "Can I help you?" The voice belonged to a woman in her mid-40s, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and kind brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Her volunteer T-shirt read, "Every animal has a story," and bore evidence of recent encounters with grateful pets. "I'm Charles Charlie." He corrected himself again. "I wanted to thank you for Max's training. He saved my life yesterday morning." "You're the drowning rescue." Sarah Morrison's face lit up with genuine delight. "Emma called this morning to tell me all about it. She was so proud of Max, said he executed a perfect water rescue just like. We practiced. You trained him for that?" "All our dogs get basic rescue training, but Max was special. He came to us as a puppy, found abandoned on the highway. From day one, he showed this incredible instinct to help. He'd comfort nervous animals, alert us when someone was hurt, bring us toys when he thought we looked sad." Sarah led Charles through the shelter, gesturing to kennels filled with animals in various stages of recovery. When Martha and Emma adopted him, I knew he'd found his perfect family. Those two give him the love he needs, and he gets to do what he was born to do. Charles paused at a kennel housing an elderly beagle with graying fur and patient eyes. "What's this one's story?" "That's Buddy. He's 12. Surrendered when his owner moved to a nursing home. Senior dogs are hard to place, most people want puppies." Sarah's voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too many good animals overlooked for younger, more convenient options. "Buddy's got maybe 3 good years left, but they'd be loyal years. He just needs someone willing to love." An old soul. The parallel wasn't lost on Charles. "What do you need here? Besides more adoptive families, I mean." Sarah laughed, but not with humor. "Everything. Funding, volunteers, supplies, time. We're operating on donations and prayer, basically. The county provides minimal support, and we're competing with larger shelters in Portland for grants." She paused in front of a bulletin board covered with adoption photos, happy families with their rescued pets. "Honestly, we're 3 months away from closing unless something changes." The words hit Charles like cold water. This place, where Max had learned to save lives and where dozens of animals waited for second chances, might disappear because of money. The same money that Charles had more of than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. His first instinct was to write a check, a large enough donation to secure the shelter's future permanently, but something held him back. Martha's words from breakfast echoed in his mind. Sometimes accepting help freely given meant more than grand gestures. What if you had more volunteers? Charles asked. Someone willing to do the daily work cleaning. Kennels, walking dogs, helping with adoption events? Sarah studied his face carefully. "Are you offering?" "I'm offering. It's not glamorous work, Charlie. Lots of cleaning, some heavy lifting, and you'll go home covered in fur and probably something less pleasant. Charles thought about his usual workday. Climate-controlled offices, catered meetings, decisions that affected thousands of people he'd never meet. When had he last done something with his hands that directly helped another living being? When? Do I start? How about now? Sarah grinned and handed him a volunteer application. Fair warning, once these animals decide they like you, you're stuck with them forever. They don't care about your schedule or your other commitments. They just know whether you show up or not. Charles spent the rest of the morning learning the shelter's routines. He cleaned kennels with the thoroughness of someone who'd forgotten what physical work felt like. He walked a nervous German shepherd named Captain, who gradually relaxed under Charles's patient handling. He helped Sarah reorganize the supply closet, a task that seemed insignificant until she explained how much time it would save her each. By lunch, Charles's designer jeans were ruined, and his hands smelled permanently of industrial cleaner, but he felt more useful than he had in months. When a family arrived to meet potential adoptees, Charles watched Sarah transform into part educator, part matchmaker, and part therapist, helping them find not just any pet, but the right pet for their specific situation. "You're a natural," Sarah said as they ate sandwiches in her tiny office. Most first-time volunteers are overwhelmed by the noise and the need. You just jumped in and started helping. Maybe I needed something to do with my hands, Charles admitted. I've spent too many years moving money around on computer screens. This feels real. That afternoon, Emma arrived at the shelter like a small hurricane of energy, backpack bouncing as she ran to Max, who waited for her with the patience of a dog who knew his schedule perfectly. "Charlie, you're here!" She launched herself into a hug that nearly knocked him over. "Grandma said you got your own cottage. Are you staying forever?" "I don't know about forever," Charles said, steadying himself against her enthusiasm. "But I'm staying for a while." "Good. Max likes having you around. I can tell. He gets this look when he approves of people." Emma studied Charles's face seriously. "You have sad eyes, but they're getting less sad. Grandma says helping animals makes people feel better about everything." That evening, Charles joined Martha and Emma for dinner again, this time contributing a grocery store cake that earned Emma's enthusiastic approval despite its obvious commercial origins. Over meatloaf and mashed potatoes, he found himself talking about his day at the shelter with an enthusiasm he hadn't felt for work in years. "Sarah mentioned the shelter might close," Charles said, watching Martha's reaction carefully. Martha's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "The county's been making noises about budget cuts. Sarah's been working miracles with almost no resources, but miracles only stretch so far. What would happen to the animals?" "Some would be transferred to other shelters if space was available. Others," Martha's voice trailed off, but Emma finished the thought with devastating clarity. "The old ones and sick ones would probably be put to sleep." That's what happened when the shelter in Brookings closed. Sarah cried for a week. Charles felt something crystallize in his chest, not the familiar calculation of business opportunities, but something warmer and more urgent. These people, this place, mattered in ways his corporate empire never had. Max, who had saved his life, came from this shelter. Buddy, the senior beagle, Captain, the nervous German shepherd, and dozens of other animals depending on this place. For their chance at happiness, his phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. "Board meeting moved to emergency. Session tomorrow. Morrison deal falling apart without your input. Please advise." Charles read the message twice, then deleted it without responding. Tomorrow he would walk dogs and clean kennels, and maybe help another family find their perfect companion. The Morrison deal, whatever it was, could survive without his input, or it couldn't. Either way, it mattered less than making sure Buddy the Beagle got his evening walk and medication. "Charlie?" Emma's voice pulled him back to the present. "Are you okay? You looked far away." Just thinking about tomorrow, Charles said, putting his phone face down on the table. I promised Sarah I'd help with the adoption event this weekend. Martha smiled with the satisfaction of someone watching a plan unfold perfectly. Harold always said the best way to heal a broken heart was to help fix someone else's problems. Looks like he was right about that, too. Later that night, Charles stood on his cottage porch and called Rebecca one more time. Cancel my Seattle appointments indefinitely, he said, watching moonlight paint silver paths across the harbor water. And Rebecca? Stop calling this an emergency. I'm exactly where I need to be. Charles woke to the sound of fishing boats leaving the harbor, their engines putting through the morning mist like a mechanical lullaby. 3 weeks in Seaside Harbor had established a routine he never could have imagined in his previous life. Coffee brewed in a kitchen where he actually cooked his own breakfast. A walk along the harbor where people nodded good morning instead of requesting meetings. And volunteer work that left him physically tired but emotionally satisfied. This morning felt different, though. Today, Pete Kowalski had promised to show him how to repair fishing nets, a skill Charles couldn't have fathomed learning a month ago. The harbor was already bustling when Charles arrived at 6 a.m. Commercial fishing boats were heading out for the day, their crews calling good-natured insults across the water while gulls wheeled overhead in hopes of easy meals. Pete's boat, the Second Chance, sat at the end of the dock, its blue hull showing the honest wear of 30 years working these waters. "Morning, Charlie." Pete's voice carried the gravelly warmth of someone who had spent decades talking over engine noise. At 68, he was built like a sea captain from Central, casting barrel-chested, gray-bearded, and possessed of hands that could tie knots in complete darkness. Ready to learn some real work? Charles had met Pete his second week in town. Drawn by the older man's habit of whittling on the dock while watching boats come and go, their friendship had developed slowly, built on shared silences and Pete's gradual realization that Charles was genuinely interested in learning rather than simply killing time. "You sure you want to teach your trade secrets to a newcomer?" Charles asked, accepting the coffee Pete poured from a thermos that looked older than Emma. "Secrets?" Pete laughed, settling onto an upturned crate with the ease of long practice. "Son, the only secret to net repair is patience and stubborn determination. Same as anything else worth doing." He handed Charles a section of damaged net, the nylon strands torn where they had snagged on underwater rocks. "The ocean don't care how much money you have or how important you think you are. It'll tear up your gear just the same." For the next 2 hours, Charles learned to weave new strands through damaged sections, his soft hands gradually developing the rhythm Pete demonstrated with casual expertise. The work required complete focus. Each knot had to be precisely positioned and tightened to specific tension, or the entire section would fail under pressure. "There's a meditation to it," Pete explained, watching Charles struggle with a particularly stubborn repair. "Your mind starts wandering to other things. The knots get sloppy. Ocean's got no patience for sloppy work." Charles found truth in the observation. When he focused completely on the net in his hands, his mind quieted in ways that meditation apps and expensive retreats had never achieved. The constant mental noise of deals and decisions and profit margins faded, replaced by the simple requirements of thread and tension and properly tied knots. "You got good hands for this," Pete said eventually, examining Charles's work with the critical eye of someone who depended on quality repairs for his livelihood. "Patient hands. Most folks your age are too set in their ways to learn something completely new." The compliment warmed Charles more than he expected. When had anyone last praised his hands for creating something rather than simply signing documents? After the net repair lesson, Charles walked Emma to school. A routine they had established when Martha mentioned her arthritis made the daily trek increasingly difficult. Emma chattered constantly during these walks, filling Charles in on playground politics and classroom dramas with the seriousness of someone reporting international incidents. "Tommy Henderson says his dad's going to be the new sheriff," Emma announced, adjusting her backpack straps with the importance of someone carrying state secrets. "But I think Sheriff Williams is too nice to retire. Besides, Tommy's dad doesn't even like dogs. And how can you be sheriff if you don't like dogs?" Charles found Emma's logic unassailable. "That does seem like a fundamental requirement for law enforcement." "Exactly. Oh, and Mrs. Peterson wants to know if you'll help with the school carnival next month. She says they need someone strong to help set up the booths, and Pete told her you were learning useful skills." The casual assumption that he would still be in Seaside Harbor next month struck Charles with unexpected force. In his previous life, plans were made months or years in advance, every commitment carefully weighed against potential returns. Here, Emma simply assumed he would want to help with the school carnival because that's what community members did. "Tell Mrs. Peterson I'd be happy to help," Charles said, realizing as he spoke that it was completely true. At the animal shelter, Charles had developed his own unofficial specialties. He excelled at socializing nervous dogs, his patient demeanor helping anxious animals learn to trust human contact again. Sarah had assigned him to work with Captain, the German Shepherd, whose previous owner had surrendered him for behavioral issues that turned out to be nothing more than lack of consistent training. He just needed someone to set clear boundaries, Sarah explained as they watched Charles work with Captain in the training yard. "Some dogs are natural followers. They want to please. They just need to understand what's expected." Charles understood the feeling. His entire career had been built on understanding expectations and exceeding them. But somewhere along the way, he had forgotten what his own expectations were beyond accumulating more wealth and power. Captain responded to Charles's calm consistency with the devotion of someone who had found his person. The transformation was remarkable, from a nervous, defensive animal to a confident dog who walked perfectly on leash and sat patiently while children petted him during adoption events. "You should adopt him," Sarah suggested one afternoon, watching Charles and Captain work together with the synchronicity of longtime partners. "He's clearly chosen you." The suggestion rattled Charles more than it should have. Adopting Captain would mean admitting he planned to stay in Seaside Harbor permanently, abandoning the empire he had spent decades building. It would mean choosing this small, quiet life over the power and influence that had defined him for so long. "I'm not sure I'm ready for that kind of commitment," Charles said, though Captain's trusting eyes made the words feel like a betrayal. His evenings had developed their own rhythm, usually spent at Martha's cottage, where Emma insisted on showing him her homework, and Max performed his latest training tricks. Martha had become something Charles had never experienced, a friend who expected nothing from him beyond showing up and participating in the quiet rituals of daily life. Tonight, Martha was teaching him to make her famous apple pie using a recipe card so old and stained it looked like a historical document. Her handwriting filled the margins with notes accumulated over decades. Extra cinnamon for holidays. Less sugar if apples are very sweet. Harold preferred thick crust. "This was my mother's recipe," Martha explained, watching Charles struggle to roll pastry dough that kept tearing under his inexperienced handling. "She taught me when I was Emma's age, and I taught Emma last year." There's something satisfying about continuing traditions like this. Charles thought about his own childhood, raised by nannies while his parents focused on building their own business empire. He couldn't remember his mother ever cooking anything, let alone teaching him family recipes. Most of his childhood memories took place in boardrooms or business dinners, where he learned to sit quietly while adults discussed things that seemed desperately important at the time. "Did you have traditions like this growing up?" Martha asked, reading his silence with characteristic perceptiveness. "Not really," Charles admitted. "My parents were busy building their company. We had staff for things like cooking, and he caught himself before revealing too much about his privileged background. "That's a shame," Martha said simply, not with judgment, but with the sadness of someone who understood what he had missed. The everyday traditions are what make a life. Few lived rather than just survived. After dinner, Emma insisted on showing Charles her school project about local heroes, a poster board covered with photographs and stories of people who made Seaside Harbor special. Pete was featured for his decades of sea rescues, Sarah for her work with abandoned animals, and Martha for organizing community meals during hard times. "I wanted to include Max," Emma explained, pointing to a photo of the golden retriever in action during a water safety demonstration. "But Mrs. Peterson said the project had to be about people. I told her Max is more of a person than some people, but she didn't understand." Charles studied the poster, struck by the realization that everyone featured had one thing in common. They had dedicated their lives to helping others, not for recognition or profit, but because that's what decent people did. When had he last used his resources to help someone without expecting something in return? That night, as he walked back to his cottage under stars unclouded by city lights, Charles's phone buzzed with another message from Rebecca. This time, it was a photo of newspaper headlines about Wentworth Industries stock dropping after Charles's prolonged absence sparked rumors about his health and the company's stability. For a moment, Charles felt the familiar anxiety of business crisis, the need to return immediately and personally manage every decision that might affect quarterly earnings. Then he looked back at Martha's cottage, where warm light still glowed in Emma's bedroom window, and he knew she was probably reading. To Max before bed, Charles deleted the message without responding and continued walking home, his hands still smelling faintly of apple pie and his mind quiet in ways that no amount of wealth had ever achieved. Tomorrow, he would teach Captain a new training exercise, help Pete with another net repair lesson, and maybe finally work up the courage to contribute something more substantial to the shelter's financial crisis. But tonight, he would fall asleep listening to the ocean and thinking about traditions worth continuing, communities worth joining, and the possibility that he had finally found something more valuable than all the money in his various bank accounts. The idea came to Charles during his morning walk with Captain, who would become his unofficial shadow, despite Sarah's patient reminders that the dog was still available for adoption. Emma had mentioned the shelter's financial crisis again the night before, her 8-year-old face serious with worry as she explained how some animals might have to be sent away if money couldn't be found. Charles had spent sleepless hours wrestling with the problem. Writing a check would solve everything instantly, but it would also expose his identity and transform him from Charlie Walker, helpful volunteer, into Charles Wentworth, billionaire benefactor. The dynamic would change irreversibly no more. Quiet mornings learning net repair with Pete. No more casual dinners with Martha and Emma. Everyone would start treating him differently, wanting things from him, calculating their interactions around his wealth. But watching Captain practice his training exercises in the morning sun, Charles realized there might be another way. What if we organized a real fundraiser? He asked Sarah when he arrived at the shelter. Not just a bake sale or car wash, but something that could raise serious money? Sarah looked up from her paperwork with the expression of someone who had heard, too, many well-intentioned suggestions that required resources she didn't have. "Charlie, we've tried everything. A county fair booth, the adoption drives, even a dinner auction last year. This community is generous, but there's only so much money to go around. What if we expanded beyond the community?" Charles pressed. Portland's only 2 hours away. There are people there who would support a cause like this if they knew about it. Marketing costs money. Professional event planning costs money. Getting Portland people to drive to Seaside Harbor for a fundraiser would require advertising we can't afford. Sarah's voice carried the weariness of someone who had run the numbers countless times. Charles spent the rest of the day working with the animals while his business mind churned through possibilities. By evening, he had the skeleton of a plan. That might work ambitious enough to raise significant funds, but grounded enough in local resources to seem realistic. That night at Martha's dinner table, he presented his idea carefully. What if we organized a Rescue Heroes Festival? Charles asked, cutting his pot roast with studied casualness. A weekend event celebrating local rescue stories, not just animals, but all kinds of rescues. Pete could tell his sea rescue stories. The Coast Guard could demonstrate water safety. Sarah could showcase the shelter animals. Emma's eyes lit up immediately. Max could do his rescue demonstrations. He loved showing off his swimming skills. It's a nice idea, Charlie, Martha said diplomatically. But organizing something like that would require permits, insurance, vendors, advertising. What if we started small? Charles interrupted. Just a one-day event in the harbor park. Local vendors, maybe some live music, rescue demonstrations, and adoption booths. If it works, we could expand it next year. The conversation continued through dessert, with Emma contributing increasingly elaborate ideas. A costume contest for pets, helicopter demonstrations, maybe even a parade, while Martha and Charles discussed more practical concerns. By the time Charles walked home, Martha had agreed to approach the town council about permits, and Emma had appointed herself chief marketing coordinator. The next morning, Charles found Pete already at work on his nets, but today the older man seemed distracted. Something troubling you? Charles asked, settling into his usual spot with the section of netting Pete had assigned him. Pete worked in silence for several minutes before answering. Got word yesterday that my nephew Jake is coming to stay with me for a while. Boy's 15, been having some trouble in Portland. His mother thinks maybe a change of scenery might help. Charles detected layers of concern in Pete's carefully neutral tone. What kind of trouble? The usual teenage stuff, but heading in the wrong direction. Skipping school, running with kids who think shoplifting is a hobby, got caught tagging buildings downtown. Pete's weathered hands moved mechanically through the familiar motions of net repair. Kids angry about his father walking out, and his mother's working 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. Sometimes anger finds the wrong outlets. The story resonated with Charles more than he expected. Michael had gone through his own angry phase at 15, lashing out at his father's constant absence and his mother's social obligations. Charles had responded by sending his son to an expensive boarding school, assuming professional guidance would solve what his own presence couldn't. When does Jake arrive? Next week. I'm hoping maybe you could help me keep an eye on him. Boy needs to see what honest work looks like, and you've got a way of making people feel useful without making them feel judged. The request touched Charles deeply. Pete was trusting him with something precious, a second chance for a troubled kid who reminded both men of their own failures and regrets. I'd be honored to help, Charles said, meaning every word. The Rescue Heroes Festival planning consumed Charles's evenings for the next week. Martha had secured the necessary permits with efficiency that would have impressed his corporate legal team, while Emma had appointed herself official poster artist, creating colorful announcements that appeared in every shop window and community. Bulletin board in town. Charles found himself coordinating details with a precision that drew on decades of business experience, while carefully avoiding anything that might reveal his background. When Sarah worried about liability insurance for the event, Charles researched solutions and found a local agent willing to donate coverage in exchange for promotional consideration. When the folk music trio Martha had contacted asked for a performance fee the committee couldn't afford, Charles anonymously covered the cost through a friend in Portland who owed him favors. Each problem solved required Careful navigation between his desire to help and his need to maintain his cover identity. Charles discovered that orchestrating change from behind the scenes was both more challenging and more satisfying than simply writing checks to make problems disappear. Jake Kowalski arrived on a Tuesday afternoon bus, 15 years old and radiating the defensive hostility of someone expecting the worst from every new situation. Charles first saw him at the harbor, slouching beside Pete with the studied indifference of a teenager, convinced that adult authority was either corrupt or stupid. "Jake, this is Charlie Walker," Pete said, performing introductions with the careful diplomacy of someone navigating potential conflict. "Charlie's been helping me with the nets, and he volunteers down at the animal shelter. Figured maybe you could lend a hand with both." Jake's assessment was immediate and unfavorable. "Ugh, I don't know anything about boats or animals." "Neither did I a month ago," Charles replied easily. "Pete's a good teacher, and the dogs at the shelter don't care about your previous experience as long as you show up." Something in Charles's tone, neither condescending nor overly encouraging, seemed to catch Jake's attention. The boy's hostility didn't disappear, but it shifted into wary curiosity. Over the following days, Charles watched Pete work with his nephew with the patience of someone who understood that trust had to be earned rather than demanded. Jake approached every task with reluctant competence, clearly intelligent despite his determination to appear uninterested in everything at the animal shelter. Jake's transformation was more dramatic. Sarah assigned him to work with the cats, explaining that felines often responded well to teenagers who weren't trying too hard to be liked. Within an hour, Jake was sitting cross-legged on the floor, while 3 formerly antisocial cats competed for his attention. "He's got the touch," Sarah told Charles quietly. "Some people are just naturally calming to animals. It's not something you can teach." Charles watched Jake gentle a nervous tabby who had been surrendered for behavioral problems, seeing in the boy's careful movements the same patience Pete had shown with damaged nets. Everyone deserved the chance to repair something broken, even if the first thing they learned to fix was themselves. The Rescue Heroes Festival was scheduled for the following Saturday, and Charles found himself both excited and terrified by what they had created. Advance registration suggested over 300 people would attend, far more than their small town usually saw outside of summer tourist season. Local vendors had donated time and products. Portland animal rescue organizations had agreed to participate, and the Coast Guard had promised a helicopter demonstration that had Emma planning her viewing strategy for maximum dramatic effect. But success would also mean attention, and attention meant questions about the festival's mysterious organizer who seemed unusually skilled at coordinating complex logistics for a simple volunteer. Friday night, as Charles made final preparations in his cottage, his phone rang with Rebecca's now familiar number. "Charles, I need to brief you on the Morrison situation," his assistant began without preamble. "The deal collapsed completely, and the board is discussing a vote of no confidence. Your absence is being interpreted as either a health crisis or complete abandonment of your responsibilities." Charles looked out his window at the harbor, where fishing boats were anchored for the night, and streetlights reflected off calm water like fallen stars. "Rebecca," he said quietly, "what if I told you that I've learned more about running a successful organization in the past month than I learned in the previous 5 years of board meetings?" "Sir, I don't understand." "Tomorrow I'm helping coordinate an event that will save an animal shelter, bring a community together, and give 300 people a chance to make a difference in something larger than themselves. The budget is less than I usually spend on lunch meetings, but the return on investment is immeasurable." The silence on the other end stretched so long that Charles wondered if the call had dropped. "Are you saying you're not coming back?" "Rebecca," finally asked Charles, watched Pete's boat rock gently in its slip, thinking about net repair and apple pie recipes and the way Captain looked at him with complete trust. "I'm saying that I'm learning what return on investment really means," he replied. "And Rebecca? After tomorrow, I might have some new perspectives on what kind of leader I want to be." He ended the call and turned off his phone, focusing instead on the final preparations for what might be either the most important day of his new life, or the last day before his old life reclaimed him completely. The Rescue Heroes Festival exceeded every expectation Charles had dared to harbor. By 10 a.m., the harbor park was filled with families, couples, and children drawn by the promise of rescue demonstrations and the chance to meet animals looking for homes. Emma had positioned herself as the unofficial festival guide, leading groups from booth to booth with the authority of someone who had personally overseen every detail. Max's water rescue demonstration drew the largest crowd, with the golden retriever performing his life-saving techniques with the precision of a professional, while Emma provided running commentary that mixed technical accuracy with 8-year-old enthusiasm. "See how Max keeps his head up so he can watch the person he's rescuing," Emma explained to the gathered audience. "And notice how he approaches from behind so they can't accidentally hurt him if they're panicking." Sarah taught him that, but Max figured out the rest himself because he's basically a genius. Charles watched from the edge of the crowd, his chest tight with pride and something deeper, a sense of belonging that had nothing to do with ownership or control and everything to do with being part of something larger than himself. The festival raised over $8,000, enough to keep the shelter operating for 6 more months, while Sarah applied for grants that required proof of community support. More importantly, 12 animals found forever homes, including Buddy the senior beagle, who charmed a retired couple looking for a calm companion who understood the value of afternoon naps. But the festival's success brought an unexpected consequence: attention from beyond Seaside Harbor's borders. "Charlie, there's someone here who wants to meet you," Sarah called over the afternoon crowd noise. Behind her stood a woman in her 30s with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to asking questions and getting answers. "I'm Jennifer Martinez from the Portland Tribune." The woman introduced herself, extending her hand with professional courtesy. "I'm doing a story about grassroots fundraising in small communities, and several people have mentioned that you were instrumental in organizing today's event." Charles felt ice form in his stomach. "I just helped with some logistics." The real organizers are Martha Clearwater and Sarah Morrison. "That's interesting," Jennifer continued, pulling out a digital recorder that looked decidedly professional. "Because my research suggests this kind of event typically requires significant experience in project management, vendor coordination, and marketing. The insurance arrangements alone would challenge most nonprofits." Behind Jennifer, Charles noticed Pete approaching with Jake, both wearing expressions of concern. Martha appeared from the direction of the apple pie booth, a grandmother's instincts clearly triggered by the sight of Charles, in conversation with someone who obviously didn't belong to their community. "I'm sure someone with more experience could have done better," Charles said carefully. "We just made the best of local resources and community generosity. Would you mind if I asked what you did before moving to Seaside Harbor?" Jennifer's question carried the casual tone of someone whose profession was extracting information from reluctant subjects. The moment stretched uncomfortably as Charles realized that his careful anonymity was cracking under the pressure of success. Emma saved him, appearing at his elbow with the perfect timing of someone who sensed her favorite adult needed rescuing. "Charlie, the Coast Guard helicopter is about to land, and you promised you'd watch with me." She grabbed his hand with the imperious authority of childhood. "Sarah says they might let some people sit inside if they're not too busy talking to reporters." Charles allowed Emma to drag him away from Jennifer Martinez, but not before he caught the journalist's knowing look. She had recognized evasion when she saw it, and her professional instincts were clearly engaged. The helicopter demonstration provided temporary distraction, But Charles remained aware of Jennifer moving through the crowd, conducting interviews, and taking photographs. Several times, he noticed her conversations, pausing when people gestured in his direction. That evening, after the festival cleanup was complete and the last vendors had departed, Charles found himself alone with Martha. On her cottage porch, Emma had fallen asleep on the living room couch, exhausted by her day as festival coordinator, while Max dozed at her feet with the satisfaction of a job well done. "That reporter was asking a lot of questions about you," Martha said without preamble, settling into her rocking chair with the directness of someone who had earned the right to speak plainly. "I noticed," Charles admitted. "You want to tell me why that worries you so much?" Charles stared out at the harbor, where festival decorations still fluttered in the evening breeze. For 6 weeks, he had lived as Charlie Walker, helpful volunteer and community member. The life felt more real than anything he had experienced in decades, but it was built on a foundation of careful omissions and deliberate misdirection. "My past is complicated," he said finally. "Most people's pasts are complicated by the time they reach our age," Martha replied. "The question is whether you're running from something you did wrong or running towards something you need to make right." The insight hit Charles with devastating accuracy. He wasn't hiding from criminal behavior or shameful secrets. He was hiding from the recognition that his previous life had been built on accumulating power and wealth, while systematically avoiding the very connections that made life meaningful. What if telling the truth meant losing all of this? Charles gestured toward the harbor, the town, the life he had built over the past weeks. What if people started treating me differently? Martha's rocking chair creaked gently as she considered his question. "Charlie, in my experience, the people worth keeping in your life are the ones who stick around after they know who you really are. The ones who leave were never really your friends to begin with." Inside the cottage, Emma stirred in her sleep, murmuring something that sounded like instructions for Max about proper rescue techniques. The sound made Charles's heart ache with protective tenderness that had nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with love. "I haven't been completely honest with you," Charles said quietly. "I figured," Martha replied with the calm of someone who had suspected as much for weeks. "Emma thinks you're probably a retired teacher because you're patient with everyone and know how to organize things. Pete thinks you might have been in the military because you understand chain of command and don't complain about hard work. Sarah thinks you're probably divorced because you get this sad look when families adopt pets together. What do you think?" Martha was quiet for so long that Charles wondered if she had fallen asleep. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "I think you're a man who lost something precious and has been looking for it in all the wrong places until now. I think whatever you did before doesn't matter nearly as much as what you choose to do going forward. And I think Emma and Max have already decided you belong here, which is the only opinion that really counts." The next morning brought both vindication and crisis in equal measure. The Portland Tribune's online edition featured Jennifer Martinez's article about the Rescue Heroes Festival, praising Seaside Harbor's community spirit and highlighting the impressive organizational achievement that had saved the local animal shelter. But buried in the article's final paragraphs was a detail that made Charles's blood freeze. Festival organizer Charlie Walker declined to discuss his professional background, though several attendees noted his sophisticated understanding of event logistics and vendor management. Tribune research could not locate any Charlie Walker matching his description in Oregon public records. Charles read the sentence 3 times, each reading confirming his worst fear. Jennifer Martinez had done her homework, and his careful anonymity was unraveling. It was only a matter of time before someone connected Charlie Walker to Charles Wentworth, and when that happened, everything he had built in Seaside Harbor would change irrevocably. His phone which he had turned back on to check the article, immediately buzzed with a call from Rebecca. "Charles, thank God." His assistant's voice carried relief and exasperation in equal measure. "The board meeting is this afternoon, and I need to know what you want me to tell them about your timeline for return." "Rebecca, I need you to do something for me," Charles said, staring out at the harbor where Pete was already preparing his nets for the day's work. "I need you to research Jennifer Martinez at the Portland Tribune. Find out what story she's working on, what her investigative focus has been recently, and whether anyone has made inquiries about Charles Wentworth's current location." The silence on the other end was telling. "Sir, has something happened? Are you in some kind of trouble?" "I'm not in trouble," Charles said slowly, "but I might be about to be exposed for something that isn't illegal, but could destroy the most important thing I've found in 20 years. After ending the call, Charles walked to the animal shelter, needing the comfort of routine and the grounding presence of animals who didn't care about his net worth or business empire. He found Jake there ahead of him, already working with the cats in the socialization room. "You're early," Charles observed, settling beside the teenager on the floor while 3 cats competed for prime lap real estate. "Couldn't sleep," Jake admitted, scratching behind the ears of a tabby who purred with theatrical volume. "Pete says when you can't sleep, it's usually because your brain is trying to work through something important." Charles recognized the wisdom in Pete's advice. "What's your brain working on?" Jake was quiet for several minutes, his attention apparently focused on the cats who had arranged themselves around him like furry meditation cushions. "I keep thinking about before," Jake said finally. "Before I came here, I mean. In Portland, I was angry all the time, and I thought it was because everyone was stupid or unfair or whatever. But now I think maybe I was angry because I didn't feel useful to anyone." The insight struck Charles as remarkably mature for a 15-year-old, and remarkably accurate for anyone trying to understand the relationship between purpose and peace. "Do you feel useful here?" Charles asked. "Yeah," Jake said simply. "Pete needs help with the boat. These cats need someone who doesn't expect them to be grateful all the time. And Sarah says I'm good at reading animal body language. It's like I have actual skills that matter to someone." Charles thought about his own skills, the ability to analyze market trends, negotiate complex deals, and manage vast financial resources. In his previous life, these abilities had made him enormously wealthy and completely miserable. Here in Seaside Harbor, his most valued contribution was his patience with nervous dogs and his willingness to clean kennels without complaint. "Jake," Charles said carefully, "what would you do if you found out that someone you trusted hadn't been completely honest about who they were?" The teenager considered this question with the seriousness it deserved. "Depends on why they weren't honest, I guess. If they were trying to hurt people or hide something bad, that's different from just wanting to start over and be treated normal. What if their real identity meant people would treat them differently? Maybe expect things from them that would change all the relationships they built?" Jake looked up from the cats with eyes that seemed older than 15. "Then I'd probably understand why they kept it secret. But I'd also figure that the people who really cared about them would still care about them no matter what." The wisdom in Jake's response gave Charles hope, but it also highlighted the impossible choice he was facing. He could continue living as Charlie Walker until Jennifer Martinez or someone else inevitably exposed his true identity. Or he could trust the people who had become his chosen family with the truth and hope Martha was right about real friends, sticking around after they knew who he really was. That evening, Charles made a decision that would either save his new life or destroy it completely. He invited Martha, Emma, Sarah, Pete, and Jake to dinner at his cottage, promising to cook his first meal for guests since arriving in Seaside Harbor. As he prepared a simple dinner of fish and vegetable skills he had learned from watching Martha over the past weeks. Charles rehearsed different ways to tell him the truth, but every version sounded like either a confession or a boast, and neither felt right. When his guests arrived, they filled his small cottage with the warmth of people who had chosen to become family. Emma immediately appointed herself assistant chef, while Max claimed his usual position as official floor supervisor. Pete and Jake examined his fishing equipment with the expertise of people who knew quality when they saw it, and Sarah helped Martha set the table with the casual intimacy of women who had coordinated countless community meals. Looking around his cottage at these people who had rescued him in ways far more profound than Max's physical intervention that first morning, Charles realized that the truth wasn't something he owed them. It was something he wanted to share because real family deserved honesty, even when honesty risked everything. Charles never got the chance to tell them himself. Emma found the magazine 3 days later while helping him organize his cottage, a Forbes issue he had forgotten he even owned, tucked between fishing guides and repair manuals in a way that suggested hasty concealment rather than careful storage. The cover featured a photo of Charles from 2 years ago, standing beside the headquarters building of Wentworth Industries with the headline, "Tech Titan's Next Billion: How Charles Wentworth Revolutionized Digital Infrastructure." "Charlie?" Emma's voice was small and confused as she held the magazine with both hands, staring at the cover image. "Why do you have a picture of yourself on this magazine? And why does it say your name is Charles Wentworth?" Charles felt the world tilt sideways. In all his careful planning about how to reveal his identity, he had never imagined this moment. Emma's innocent confusion transforming into something that looked dangerously close to betrayal. "Emma, I can explain. You lied to me." Her voice remained small, but now it carried the particular pain of someone who had trusted completely and been proven wrong. "You said your name was Charlie Walker. You said you were just learning about boats and animals and everything. But this magazine says you're really, really rich and important." Max, sensing Emma's distress, padded over to lean against her legs with the solid comfort of someone who never lied about anything. The gesture made Charles's heart break a little more. "My name is Charles Wentworth," he said gently, kneeling to meet Emma's eyes at her level. "Charlie is what my friends called me when I was young, before I became all those things the magazine talks about. I wanted to be Charlie again because being Charlie felt better than being Charles." Emma's blue eyes filled with tears she was too proud to shed. "But you didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth. I told you all my secrets, and you didn't tell me any of yours." The accusation hit harder than any board meeting confrontation or hostile takeover attempt Charles had ever endured. Emma was right. She had shared her world with complete openness, while he had carefully constructed a false identity designed to protect himself from exactly this kind of pain. "You're right," Charles said simply. "I should have trusted you. I was scared that if people knew who I really was, they wouldn't want to be my friends anymore." "That's stupid," Emma said, but her voice was less angry than sad. "Max doesn't care if you're rich. He just cares if you're nice to him and show up when you say you will. I'm like Max that way." Before Charles could respond, Emma had turned and run from the cottage, the magazine clutched in her small hands like evidence of a crime. Max hesitated for a moment, torn between following his girl and staying with the man who had become important to him, before loyalty to Emma won, and he trotted after her. Charles sat alone on his cottage floor, surrounded by the life he had built as Charlie Walker, and waited for the inevitable consequences of Emma's discovery. He didn't have to wait long. Within 2 hours, his phone was ringing with Martha's number. "Charles Wentworth." Martha's voice carried no anger, just the weariness of someone who had hoped for better. "Emma showed me the magazine. She's upstairs crying, and I'm downstairs trying to figure out how to explain to an 8-year-old why adults sometimes choose to lie about who they are. Martha, please let me come over and explain. I think you've done enough explaining for one day." Martha said, but her tone was more sad than harsh. Emma trusted you completely, Charles. Do you understand what that means to a little girl who lost her parents when she was 5? Trust isn't something she gives lightly. The knowledge that Emma was an orphan hit Charles like a physical blow. In all their time together, he had somehow missed or ignored the significance of why she lived with her grandmother, why she was so hungry for adult attention and approval. He had been so focused on his own needs for connection that he had failed to understand the depth of her vulnerability. I didn't know about her parents, he said quietly. There's a lot you didn't know because you were too busy protecting yourself to ask the right questions. Martha replied, the question now is what you plan to do about it. After Martha hung up, Charles walked to the harbor, needing the steady rhythm of waves against hulls to calm his churning thoughts. He found Pete working alone on his boat, mending nets with the methodical precision of someone using familiar work to process difficult emotions. Heard the news, Pete said, without looking up from his repair work. Emma ran straight to Sarah. At the shelter, magazine in hand, talking about how Charlie was really some rich guy who'd been pretending to be normal. Charles settled onto the dock beside Pete's boat, watching the older man's weathered hands move through motions perfected over decades. I never meant for her to find out that way. How did you mean for her to find out? Pete's question was direct, but not accusatory. Because that little girl's been planning your permanent adoption into her family since the day Max pulled you out of the water. She's been bragging to everyone at school about her friend Charlie, who's learning to be useful instead of just important. The phrase hit Charles with devastating accuracy. Learning to be useful instead of just important. Was that what he had been doing these past weeks? And had he been so successful at it that he had lost sight of the people who had made that transformation possible? What did Sarah say? Charles asked. Sarah's hurt, Pete replied bluntly. Not about the money. She doesn't care if you're rich or poor. She's hurt because she's been falling in love with Charlie Walker. And now she's wondering if Charlie Walker ever really existed or if he was just a character you were playing. The words felt like physical blows. Charles had been so focused on protecting himself from the expectations that came with his wealth that he had never considered how his deception would affect the people who cared about him. What about you? Charles asked. What do you think? Pete tied off his repair and finally looked directly at Charles. I think you're a scared old man who found something precious and was too afraid of losing it to trust it completely. I also think that fear just cost you the very thing you were trying to protect. That evening, Charles sat in his cottage and faced the wreckage of the life he had tried to build. His phone buzzed constantly with calls from Rebecca, who had somehow learned about the magazine incident and was demanding immediate damage control strategies. The Seattle Times had picked up the story of the missing billionaire found volunteering at a small-town animal shelter. 3 different business publications wanted statements about his mental health and plans for returning to corporate leadership, but Charles ignored all of them, focusing instead on a single text message from Jake. Pete says you're probably beating yourself up pretty bad right now. For what it's worth, I think keeping secrets sucks. But I also think you're the same guy who taught me how to gentle scared cats. That Charlie wasn't fake. He was just part of you that you've been hiding. The wisdom in Jake's message gave Charles a glimmer of hope, but it also clarified what he needed to do. Charlie Walker wasn't a false identity he had created to deceive people. Charlie was who he really was when he allowed himself to focus on connection rather than control, on contribution rather than accumulation. The next morning, Charles walked to Emma's school. He waited outside until recess, when she emerged with her classmates onto the playground where they had first talked about heroes and rescue animals and the importance of showing up for people who needed you. Emma saw him immediately, but didn't approach. Instead, she stood by the swing set, watching him with the wary assessment of someone who had learned that adults could disappoint you even when you thought they were safe. Charles walked over slowly, sitting on a swing beside hers without speaking. They sat in silence for several minutes, watching other children play games that required nothing more complicated than agreeing on the rules and trusting that everyone would follow them. "I brought you something," Charles said finally, pulling a small wrapped package from his jacket pocket. Emma accepted the package with the careful politeness of someone who wasn't sure whether gifts were apologies or bribes. Inside was a simple silver locket, not expensive, just pretty, with a photo of Max inside. "Sarah helped me pick it out," Charles explained. "She said you might like having Max's picture with you even when he can't be." Emma opened the locket and stared at Max's familiar face, her own expression unreadable. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you the truth from the beginning," Charles continued. "You're right that it was stupid to think you wouldn't want to be my friend anymore. You're also right that Max doesn't care about money. He just cares about whether people are kind and whether they show up when they say they will." "Are you going to keep showing up?" Emma asked, her voice very small. "Do you want me to?" Emma was quiet for a long time, swinging gently while she considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Grandma says that sometimes people lie because they're scared, and sometimes they lie because they're mean," she said finally. "She says the difference is whether they keep lying after they get caught, or whether they try to fix things. Which kind do you think I am?" Emma studied his face with the intensity of someone making a crucial decision. "I think you were scared. But I also think Charlie was real, even if Charles is your real name. I like Charlie better because he listened to me and helped with my homework and didn't act like he had more important things to do." "Charlie is still here," Charles said gently. "Being rich doesn't change the fact that I like helping with your homework and listening to your stories about school. It just means I have more money than I know what to do with." Emma considered this information with the practical assessment of childhood. If you have more money than you know what to do with, does that mean you could save the animal shelter forever instead of just for 6 months? The question cut straight to the heart of Charles's dilemma. Yes, he could save the shelter permanently with a donation that would barely register in his personal finances. But doing so would transform him from Charlie Walker, community volunteer, into Charles Wentworth, billionaire benefactor. Every interaction afterward would be filtered through the lens of his wealth. "I could," Charles said carefully, "but it might change how people treat me. They might start seeing me as a rich guy who writes checks instead of Charlie who cleans kennels and walks dogs." Emma swung higher, thinking hard about this problem. "What if we made a rule that you can only help the shelter by doing work, not by giving money? That way people would have to treat you like regular Charlie instead of rich Charles." The innocence of her solution made Charles's heart ache. If only adult problems could be solved with such straightforward rules. "Would that work for you?" Charles asked. "If I promise to help the shelter by working instead of just writing checks?" "Only if you also promise not to lie about who you are anymore," Emma said firmly. "Even if your real name is Charles, I want to keep calling you Charlie because that's who you were when we became friends." Charles extended his hand for a formal handshake. "Deal. Charlie it is, and no more lies about anything." Emma shook his hand with the gravity of someone sealing an important contract. "Deal. But Charlie? Yes, you still have to apologize to Grandma Martha and Sarah and Pete. They're not kids, they need grown-up apologies, not just presents." As Charles walked back from the school, Emma's words echoing in his mind, he realized that she was right about needing to make grown-up apologies. But more than that, he needed to find a way to be both Charles and Charlie, to integrate his resources and experience with the authenticity and connection he had found in Seaside Harbor. The solution, when it came to him that evening, was both simple and terrifying: complete transparency. Not just about his identity, but about his intentions, his fears, and his desperate hope that the people who had become his chosen family might be willing to forgive his deception and help him figure out how to use his wealth in ways that strengthened, rather than corrupted, the life they had built together. But first, he had 3 very important apologies to make. Charles's carefully planned apology tour lasted exactly 18 hours before everything exploded beyond his control. He had started with Martha arriving at her cottage that evening with a bouquet of flowers from her own garden, a gesture that she appreciated, even as she pointed out the irony of giving someone their own daisies as an apology gift. Their conversation had been difficult but healing, with Martha expressing her disappointment, while also acknowledging that she understood his fears about being valued for his money rather than himself. "The thing about trust, Charles," Martha had said over tea served in her best china, "is that it's not about being perfect. It's about being honest when you make mistakes and working to do better next time." His apology to Pete had been even more challenging, requiring Charles to sit on the dock at dawn while the older man processed his hurt and anger through the familiar motions of net repair. Pete's disappointment wasn't about the deception itself, but about the fact that Charles hadn't trusted him enough to share his real story. 40 years I've been helping people in this town," Pete had said, his weathered hands never pausing in their work. "Rich folks, poor folks, crazy folks, and regular folks. You know what I've learned? People are just people, no matter how much money they have. The ones worth knowing are worth knowing regardless, and the ones who aren't worth knowing regardless." But it was his planned apology to Sarah that went catastrophically wrong. Charles arrived at the animal shelter early Thursday morning, hoping to catch Sarah during her quiet pre-opening routine when they could speak privately. Instead, he found the parking lot filled with news vans and reporters, while Sarah stood trapped near the entrance, fielding questions from journalists who had clearly done their research. "Ms. Morrison, how long have you been in a romantic relationship with billionaire Charles Wentworth?" a reporter called out, shoving a microphone towards Sarah's face. We're not." Sarah's voice carried the panic of someone completely unprepared for media attention. "Charlie volunteers here. That's all. Sources suggest that Mr. Wentworth has been using his wealth to influence local politics and business decisions." Another reporter pressed, "Can you comment on whether the recent animal shelter fundraising was actually a cover for a larger development plans?" Charles watched in horror as Sarah's confusion transformed into something much worse. The dawning realization that his presence in Seaside Harbor might have put her and the shelter in the crosshairs of exactly the kind of corporate scrutiny they couldn't afford. "I don't know anything about development plans," Sarah said, backing toward the shelter entrance. "I just run an animal shelter." Charles pushed through the crowd of reporters, ignoring their shouted questions about his mental health, his business plans, and his relationship status. "Sarah, let me explain. Don't." Her voice was quiet but firm. "Just don't, Charles. Not here. Not with them watching every word." She disappeared into the shelter, leaving Charles facing a barrage of cameras and questions he couldn't answer, without making everything worse. Behind him, he could hear the animals inside beginning to bark and meow in response to the unusual commotion. The very creatures he had hoped to protect, now stressed because of his presence in their lives, by noon, the story had exploded across social media and business news outlets. #Billionaire Charlie was trending on Twitter, with speculation ranging from a mental health crisis to an elaborate tax avoidance scheme. The Seaside Harbor town website had crashed under the sudden traffic load, and Martha reported that reporters were knocking on doors throughout the neighborhood, asking residents about their experiences with the mysterious wealthy volunteer. But the worst was yet to come. Charles's phone rang just after lunch with Rebecca's number, but when he answered, the voice wasn't his assistant's. "Mr. Wentworth, this is David Chun, chairman of your board of directors." The voice carried the cold authority of someone accustomed to wielding power without question. "We need to discuss your situation immediately. David, I'm in the middle of... You're in the middle of a public relations disaster that's affecting our stock price and raising questions about your competency to lead this company," Chun interrupted. "The board has called an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning. Your presence is required." "I'm not coming back to Seattle," Charles said, surprising himself with the firmness of his decision. "Whatever the board needs to discuss can be handled remotely." "Charles, let me be very clear about the situation." Chun's voice dropped to the register reserved for ultimate ultimatums. "You have been absent from your duties for over 2 months without proper notification or delegation of authority. You have ignored critical business decisions, missed essential meetings, and now you're making headlines that suggest either mental instability or complete abandonment of your fiduciary responsibilities." Charles stared out his cottage window at the harbor, where Pete's boat sat peacefully at its mooring, despite the chaos swirling around the rest of the town. "The board has prepared a resolution declaring you temporarily unfit to serve as CEO pending a complete psychiatric evaluation and transition plan," Chun continued. "If you return immediately and cooperate fully with our requirements, we can present this as a voluntary medical leave. If you don't, we'll vote you out entirely and make sure every business publication in the country knows that Charles Wentworth chose to abandon his responsibilities for some kind of midlife crisis involving small-town volunteer work and local women." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a burning bridge. Charles had built Wentworth Industries from a small software consulting firm into a multi-billion-dollar empire. But he had also structured the company in ways that gave the board significant power if they chose to use it collectively. "You have 24 hours to decide, Charles," Chun said. "Come back and salvage your reputation and your company, or lose everything you've spent your life building." After the call ended, Charles sat in his cottage and tried to process what he had just heard. Returning to Seattle would mean abandoning the life he had built in Seaside Harbor, the community connections, the meaningful work, the possibility of a relationship with Sarah, and most importantly, his relationship with Emma and Martha and the chosen family that had rescued him in ways far more profound than Max's physical intervention. But staying would mean losing the company he had built, the financial resources that allowed him to help people on a larger scale, and possibly the respect of everyone who had supported his business vision over the decades. A knock on his door interrupted his spiral of impossible choices. Emma stood on his porch, still wearing her school backpack and holding Max's leash, her young face serious with the weight of someone delivering important news. "The reporters came to my school," she announced without preamble. "They asked my teacher about you, and they asked me if you ever gave me expensive presents or promised my family money." Charles felt sick. "What did you tell them?" "I told them you helped me with math homework and taught Max new tricks, and that you made Grandma Martha laugh more than she had since Grandpa Harold died." Emma's voice carried the simple honesty that had first drawn Charles to her. "I told them you were a good friend who just happened to be rich, but they kept asking weird questions like I was lying." "I'm sorry they bothered you at school," Charles said, kneeling to meet her eyes. "None of this should have affected you. Are you going back to Seattle?" Emma asked with the directness of childhood. "I don't know," Charles admitted. "It's complicated." Emma considered this answer with the seriousness of someone who had learned that adult complications often meant the end of things children valued. "Grandma, Martha says that when adults say things are complicated, it usually means they're scared to make the right choice because the right choice is hard," Emma said. "She also says that the best way to figure out the right choice is to think about what kind of person you want to be when you grow up. What if you're already grown up? Then you think about what kind of person you want to be when you get old," Emma replied with impeccable logic. "Like really old, like Grandma Martha old. That evening, Charles made one more attempt to speak with Sarah, arriving at her cottage after dark when the reporters had finally dispersed. She answered the door but didn't invite him in, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed and her expression carefully neutral. "I know you didn't ask for any of this," Charles began. "You're right," Sarah replied. "I didn't ask to have reporters questioning my professional ethics, my personal life, and my motives for running an animal shelter. I didn't ask to have my organization scrutinized as if we were some kind of money laundering operation instead of people trying to help abandoned animals. Sarah, please let me explain what really happened. I know what really happened." "Charles," she said, and the use of his formal name felt like a door closing. "You decided to play a role for a few weeks, and when that role got complicated, you forgot that the rest of us weren't playing. We were just living our lives, trying to do good work, and trusting someone who wasn't being honest about who he was. Charlie wasn't the role," Charles said desperately. "Charlie was me. The me I wanted to be. The me I should have been all along." "Maybe that's true," Sarah said softly. "But right now I can't tell the difference between Charles the billionaire, Charlie the volunteer, and Charles the man who's about to break Emma's heart by leaving when things get too difficult." She closed the door gently but firmly, leaving Charles alone on her porch with the weight of choices that would determine not just his future, but the futures of everyone he had come to love in this small town by the sea. Back in his cottage, Charles packed a small suitcase and stared at his phone, where 17 missed calls from Rebecca waited alongside increasingly urgent text messages from board members, lawyers, and business associates who had spent decades depending on his leadership. The packed suitcase sat on his bed like an accusation. Inside were the expensive clothes he had worn to Seaside Harbor 2 months ago, designer suits, and Italian leather shoes that belonged to Charles Wentworth, CEO and billionaire. The flannel shirts and work jeans that belonged to Charlie Walker hung in the closet. Smelling faintly of animal shelter and salt air. At midnight, Charles made his choice. He called Rebecca. Thank God, his assistant's voice carried exhaustion and relief in equal measure. "Charles, I have a car waiting to bring you back to Seattle. We can have you in the boardroom by 8 a.m. And legal has prepared a statement about your extended medical leave." "Rebecca, I'm not coming back," Charles said quietly. The silence stretched so long that Charles wondered if the call had dropped. "Sir, I need you to think very carefully about what you're saying," Rebecca finally replied, her professional composure beginning to crack. "The board isn't bluffing. They have the votes to remove you, and they have the legal grounds to do it. You'll lose everything." "Not everything," Charles said, looking out his window at the harbor where morning fishermen were beginning to prepare their boats. "I'll lose the company and most of the money and probably the respect of everyone in the business world. But I won't lose the things that actually matter. What could matter more than the empire you built?" Charles thought about Emma's trust, Martha's apple pie recipes, Pete's patient instruction in net repair, Jake's transformation from angry teenager to confident young man, Sarah's dedication to saving abandoned animals, and Max's unconditional acceptance of everyone who needed rescuing. "I built an empire, Rebecca, but I never built a life. These people gave me a life. The choice isn't between staying here and going back to Seattle. The choice is between being someone who abandons the people he loves when things get difficult, or being someone who stands up for what matters most. Charles, my decision is final. Draft whatever papers you need to draft. Schedule whatever meetings you need to schedule, but do it without me. I'm staying in Seaside Harbor." After ending the call, Charles unpacked his suitcase and went for a walk through the sleeping town. He passed Martha's cottage, where a light still glowed in the kitchen window, probably Martha staying up late, worrying about the upheaval his presence had brought to their peaceful community. He walked past Sarah's house, dark and quiet, and Wondered if she was lying awake, wondering whether he would still be there in the morning, or if he would disappear like so many other people who had entered and left her life at the harbor. He found Pete sitting on his boat, staring out at the dark water. Couldn't sleep either? Pete asked without turning around. Too much thinking, Charles admitted, settling beside his friend on the boat's worn deck. Thinking about leaving? Thinking about staying? Pete nodded as if this made perfect sense. Those reporters came by my boat this afternoon. Wanted to know if you'd ever offered me money or tried to buy influence in local politics. Told them. You were the worst influence buyer I'd ever met. Couldn't even convince Jake to bait a hook properly for the first week. Despite everything, Charles smiled. What else did you tell them? Told them that in my experience, a man's worth isn't measured by what he owns, but by what he's willing to sacrifice for the people he cares about. Pete finally turned to look at Charles directly. Question is, what are you willing to sacrifice? Charlie? The answer came to Charles with crystalline clarity. He was willing to sacrifice his fortune, his corporate empire, his reputation in the business world, and the comfortable isolation that wealth had provided. What he wasn't willing to sacrifice was the connection he had found with people who valued him for his presence rather than his portfolio. Everything except what really matters, Charles said. Pete smiled, the first genuine smile Charles had seen from him since the magazine incident. Then, I guess you better start figuring out how to convince the people who really matter that you mean it. The next morning brought consequences that Charles had anticipated and others that blindsided him completely. He woke to find his cottage surrounded by reporters, their satellite trucks creating a traffic jam on quiet Driftwood Lane. His neighbors' people, who had begun to accept him as just another resident, now peered suspiciously from their windows, while camera crews filmed their every reaction. But the real shock came when he checked the news on his laptop. Wentworth Industries stock had dropped 18% in overnight trading following leaked reports of Charles's complete psychological break and the board's emergency vote of no confidence. The business media was having a field day with speculation about corporate instability and the dangers of unchecked CEO authority. More personally devastating was the headline in the Portland Tribune. Billionaire's small-town romance raises questions about local animal shelter finances. Jennifer Martinez had written a follow-up story suggesting that Charles's relationship with Sarah Morrison might have influenced his donations to the shelter, implying potential financial impropriety that could trigger county investigations into the organization's nonprofit status. Charles, through his laptop, closed in disgust. His attempt to escape the corrupting influence of his wealth had ended up corrupting the very people he had hoped to help. His phone rang with Martha's number, the first call he had received from any of his Seaside Harbor family since the media explosion began. Charles, you need to come over here right away. Martha's voice carried an urgency that made his stomach clench. Something's happened with Emma. Charles grabbed his jacket and headed for the back door, avoiding the reporters camping on his front porch. He cut through neighbors' yards and along the beach path, reaching Martha's cottage to find Emma sitting at the kitchen table, her school backpack beside her and her face streaked with tears. What happened? Charles asked, settling into the chair across from her. They came to school again, Emma said without looking up. But this time, they weren't just asking questions. They were asking if you ever touched me weird or gave me things my family couldn't afford or made me keep secrets. Charles felt ice form in his veins. Emma, I know you didn't do any of those things, Emma continued, her voice small but determined. But Mrs. Peterson had to call Grandma. Martha and the school counselor had to ask me all these questions about whether I felt safe around you. And now everyone at school thinks you might be some kind of bad person who tricks kids. Martha placed a protective hand on Emma's shoulder. The school district is requiring that she not have any unsupervised contact with you until this media attention dies down. They're treating you as a potential liability." The words hit Charles like physical blows. In trying to find genuine human connection, he had inadvertently exposed Emma to exactly the kind of scrutiny and suspicion that could traumatize a child who had already lost too much. "I never meant for any of this to happen," Charles said, his voice rough with emotion. "I know that," Martha replied. "But intent doesn't always matter when it comes to consequences. Emma's been through enough upheaval in her young life. She doesn't need to be the center of a media circus questioning her safety and your motives." Charles looked at Emma, who was systematically tearing her paper napkin into tiny pieces while tears dripped steadily onto the kitchen table. This brilliant, brave, compassionate little girl who had welcomed him into her world with open arms was now suffering because of his presence in her life. "What do you need me to do?" Charles asked. Martha's answer was as gentle as it was devastating. "I think you need to step back from Emma's life until this situation resolves itself, for her protection and yours." The rest of the day brought a cascade of complications that made Charles's personal heartbreak seem almost manageable by comparison. Sarah called to inform him that the county was indeed launching an investigation into the animal shelter's finances, triggered by the media speculation about his donations and involvement. The shelter's upcoming adoption events had been canceled, and 3 families had withdrawn applications to adopt animals they had been waiting weeks to welcome home. Pete's nephew Jake had been questioned by a social worker who wanted to understand why a wealthy stranger was mentoring a troubled teenager. The implication that Charles might have inappropriate motives for befriending a 15-year-old boy created exactly the kind of suspicion that could destroy Jake's progress and Pete's trust. Even the Rescue Heroes Festival, which had been such a triumph just weeks earlier, was now being scrutinized as a possible money laundering operation or tax avoidance scheme. The positive coverage that had helped the community feel proud of their achievement was being replaced by cynical analysis that reduced their genuine effort to suspicious financial maneuvering. By afternoon, Charles realized that his presence in Seaside Harbor had become actively harmful to everyone he cared about. The people who had rescued him were now suffering because of their association with him. The life he had built as Charlie Walker was crumbling under the weight of Charles Wentworth's public identity. That evening, Pete organized what he called a family meeting at Martha's cottage. Sarah came reluctantly. Jake arrived with the defensive posture of someone expecting bad news, and Martha served coffee while Emma sat curled up with Max on the living room couch, deliberately not looking at Charles. "We need to talk about the elephant in the room," Pete began with characteristic directness. "Charles, whatever you want to be called, your situation is affecting all of us, and we need to figure out how to handle it. The reporters are calling the shelter every hour," Sarah said, her professional composure barely concealing her exhaustion. "They want statements about our relationship, our finances, and whether you've influenced any of our operational decisions. I can't do my job when I'm spending all my time explaining to journalists that we run a legitimate nonprofit organization. My social worker wants to know if you've ever given me money or expensive gifts," Jake added. "She's treating me like I might be some kind of victim instead of someone who's actually gotten his life together." Charles listened to each concern with growing horror at what his deception had cost them. These people had given him the gift of authentic relationship, and he had repaid them by making their lives immeasurably more complicated. "I think," Charles said carefully, "that I need to leave Seaside Harbor." The statement hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished fire. Emma's head snapped up from Max's fur, her eyes wide with the particular panic of someone who had learned too young that people she cared about could disappear without warning. "No," she said quietly, then louder. "No, you can't leave. You promised." You would stay and help and be my friend Charlie. Martha said gently. Sometimes adults have to make hard choices to protect the people they care about. That's stupid, Emma said, her voice rising with the passionate certainty of childhood. If he leaves because of reporters and mean people saying lies, then the reporters and mean people win. That's not how you're supposed to handle bullies. Charles felt his heart break a little more at the simple clarity of Emma's logic. She was right. Leaving would mean allowing external pressure to destroy something precious and authentic. But staying meant continuing to expose everyone he loved to scrutiny and suspicion they didn't deserve. What if there was another way? Charles asked slowly, an idea beginning to form in his mind. What if instead of hiding from who I am or running away from the consequences, I face them directly? What do you mean? Sarah asked. Charles thought about Emma's wisdom regarding bullies, Pete's advice about sacrificing for people you care about, and Martha's insight that trust was about being honest when you make mistakes. What if I called a town meeting? Charles said. What if I told everyone in Seaside Harbor the complete truth about who I am, why I came here, and what I've learned? What if I let the community decide whether they want Charles Wentworth to stay as a permanent resident, knowing exactly what that would mean? Pete leaned forward in his chair. That's either the bravest thing you could do or the stupidest. Maybe both, Charles admitted. But Emma's right about not letting bullies win. And I think the people of this town deserve to hear the truth directly from me rather than filtered through reporters who don't understand what we've built here. Martha set down her coffee cup with the decisive click of someone making an important decision. I'll call the town council tonight. We can have a meeting by Friday evening. Are you sure about this? Sarah asked. Once you put everything out in the open, you can't take it back. Charles looked around the room at these people who had become his chosen family, Pete with his weathered wisdom, Martha with her fierce protectiveness, Jake with his hard-won trust, Sarah with her cautious hope, and Emma with her 8-year-old certainty that right and wrong should be simple enough for anyone to understand. I'm sure, he said. It's time to stop protecting myself and start protecting the people who matter most. Emma slipped off the couch and walked over to Charles, wrapping her small arms around his waist in a fierce hug that felt like absolution. I'm proud of you for being brave instead of scared, she whispered against his shirt. Max would be proud too. As if summoned by his name, Max patted over and rested his golden head on Charles's knee, looking up with the same expression of complete acceptance he had shown that first morning when he pulled a drowning stranger from the cold Pacific waters. Friday evening couldn't come fast enough. The Seaside Harbor Community Center hadn't seen a crowd like this since the Christmas pageant of 1987. Every seat was filled. People lined the walls, and latecomers crowded the doorway, hoping to catch portions of what everyone knew would be either a public confession or a community reckoning. Charles arrived 30 minutes early, wearing one of Harold's old flannel shirts and the work jeans that had become his uniform over the past months. He had deliberately chosen clothes that belonged to Charlie Walker rather than Charles Wentworth, though he understood that tonight would determine whether that distinction had any meaning beyond his own desperate hope for reinvention. Martha, Pete, and Jake sat in the front row, their presence both supportive and sobering. Sarah had claimed a seat near the middle, her professional distance carefully maintained while her personal investment showed in the way she twisted her hands in her lap. Emma sat beside Martha, clutching Max's rescue collar, the artifact the town had made to honor his heroism, now serving as a talisman for courage in the face of uncertainty. Mayor Patricia Henderson called the meeting to order with the gravitas of someone who understood that tonight's proceedings would define Seaside Harbor's relationship with its most famous resident for years to come. We're here tonight because Charles Wentworth has requested the opportunity to address our community directly, Mayor Henderson announced, her voice carrying across the packed room. Given the recent media attention and questions about Mr. Wentworth's presence in our town, the council felt it was appropriate to provide this forum for honest discussion. Charles stood and walked to the makeshift podium, facing a sea of faces that ranged from genuinely curious to openly hostile. In the back, he noticed several people with cameras and notebooks, reporters who had discovered the meeting despite the community's attempts to keep it local. "Thank you all for coming," Charles began, his voice steadier than he had expected. "I know many of you have questions about who I am, why I'm here, and what my presence means for Seaside Harbor. I owe you honest answers to all of those questions." He paused, making eye contact with as many people as possible, seeing neighbors who had nodded good morning eyes walks, fellow volunteers from community events, and parents whose children played on the same playground where he and Emma had shared their first real conversation. "My name is Charles Wentworth," he continued, "and yes, I am the billionaire you've been reading about in the news. I came to Seaside Harbor 2 months ago to evaluate a resort development project that would have changed this community permanently." A murmur ran through the crowd. Charles noticed several people turning to whisper to their neighbors, and he caught fragments of conversation. Knew it. Development. Outsider. "I never completed that evaluation," Charles said, raising his voice slightly to regain attention. "Because on my first morning here, I nearly drowned in your waters. A little girl's golden retriever saved my life, and in that moment, everything I thought I understood about success and purpose and what makes a life worth living changed completely." Charles looked directly at Emma, who was sitting forward in her seat with the intensity of someone following every word. "I told you my name was Charlie Walker because that's who I wanted to be," Charles continued. "Not the billionaire who owned more than he could ever use, but the man who had time to learn useful skills, to help with meaningful work, and to build relationships based on who I was rather than what I owned." "So you lied to us," called out Tom Henderson from the middle of the room, his voice carrying the anger of someone who felt deliberately deceived. "Yes," Charles said simply. "I lied about my name and my background because I was afraid that if you knew I was wealthy, you would treat me differently. I was afraid you would see me as a problem to be managed or an opportunity to be leveraged rather than a neighbor who wanted to belong somewhere." Sarah stood up, her movement drawing every eye in the room. "Charles, what about the shelter? Did you manipulate our fundraising efforts? Did you use your resources to influence our operations?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Charles understood that his answer would determine not just Sarah's trust, but the community's willingness to believe his motives have been genuine. "I never donated money to the shelter under false pretenses," Charles said carefully. "Every dollar raised for the Rescue Heroes Festival came from local supporters and Portland area donors who responded to our legitimate outreach. I did use my business contacts to help with logistics, insurance, permits, vendor relationships, but I never wrote checks or used my wealth to create artificial success." "What about now?" This question came from Janet Morrison, Sarah's aunt, who worked at the hardware store and had sold Charles supplies for various community projects. "Now that we know who you are, what do you want from us?" Charles had anticipated this question, but answering it required him to expose his deepest vulnerabilities in front of people who had every right to reject him completely. "I want to stay," he said quietly, then repeated it louder. "I want to stay in Seaside Harbor as a permanent resident and community member, not as Charles Wentworth the billionaire, but as Charlie Walker who happens to have more money than he needs." "What's the difference?" called out Pete, though Charles could hear support rather than challenge in his friend's voice. "The difference," Charles replied, "is that Charles Wentworth uses his wealth to control outcomes and avoid inconvenience. Charlie Walker uses whatever resources he has to support the people and causes he cares about, without expecting gratitude or special treatment. In return, Emma raised her hand with the formality of someone who had learned meeting protocols in school civics class. "Yes, Emma?" Mayor Henderson said, smiling at the 8-year-old's seriousness. "I have a question for Charlie," Emma announced, standing up beside her seat with Max at her side. "If you stay here forever, does that mean you'll still help me with math homework even though you're really rich? And will you still clean animal pens at the shelter, even though you could probably buy your own shelter?" The innocent directness of Emma's questions cut through the adult complications and political implications to the heart of what mattered most. Would Charles's revealed wealth change the relationships he had built? "Yes to both questions, Charles," said, his voice thick with emotion. "Being rich doesn't change the fact that I like helping with your homework. And it doesn't change the fact that animals need people to clean their pens and walk them and help them find families." Jake stood up next, his teenage awkwardness making his words even more powerful. "I want to say something," Jake announced, looking around the room with the defiance of someone who had learned to speak up for people he cared about. "Charlie taught me how to work with scared cats and how to fix fishing nets and how to show up for people even when you don't feel like it. I don't care if his real name is Charles or if he's got $1 billion. He's the same guy who helped me figure out how to not be angry all the time." Martha rose from her seat with the dignity of someone whose opinion carried weight in the community. "I've lived in Seaside Harbor for 63 years, Martha said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "I've seen people come and go, and I've learned to tell the difference between those who want to use our community and those who want to join it. Charles has spent 2 months learning our ways, contributing to our efforts, and caring about our success. He made mistakes by not being honest about his identity, but his actions have been those of someone who wants to belong here." Charles felt tears threatening as Martha continued. "More than that, he gave my granddaughter something precious, friendship with an adult who listens to her, encourages her, and shows up consistently. Emma has been happier these past 2 months than she's been since her parents died. That matters more to me than whatever name's on his bank account." The room erupted in conversation as neighbors turned to discuss Martha's words with each other. Charles caught fragments of debate, support mixed with skepticism, curiosity balanced with concern about the media attention his presence would continue to attract. Mayor Henderson called for order, and gradually the room settled back to attention. "Charles," the mayor said formally, "if the community were to accept your request to remain as a permanent resident, what specific commitments would you be willing to make regarding your wealth and its impact on our town?" Charles had spent days preparing for this question, understanding that his answer would need to be both specific enough to be meaningful and flexible enough to be practical. "I would establish a community-controlled foundation funded by my resources but governed entirely by local residents," Charles said. "I would commit to transparency about any financial contributions I make to local organizations or causes. And I would agree to limit my personal donations to amounts that supplement rather than dominate community fundraising efforts." "What about business investments?" asked Jim Kowalski, Pete's brother who owned the marina. "Are you planning to buy up property or influence local business decisions?" "No," Charles said firmly. "I have no interest in controlling or changing Seaside Harbor's economy or character. I want to be a community member, not a community owner." Sarah stood again, and Charles's heart clenched at the careful neutrality in her expression. "I need to ask this directly," Sarah said, her professional voice carrying across the room. "Are you prepared to live as a regular community member? Or will you expect special treatment because of your wealth? Will you be Charlie Walker, who happens to have money, or Charles Wentworth, who's trying to play at being ordinary?" The question struck at Charles's deepest fear, that he was incapable of truly integrating his wealth with authentic community membership, that he would always be either hiding his resources or wielding them inappropriately. "I don't know," Charles admitted, the honesty surprising even himself. I've never tried to be both wealthy and normal at the same time. But I'm willing to learn, and I'm willing to be held accountable by people who care enough to correct me when I get it wrong. Emma raised her hand again. Charlie, she said, her 8-year-old voice cutting through the adult complexity with devastating simplicity. Do you pinky promise to stay even if some people are mean to you about being rich? Charles looked down at Emma's earnest face, at Max sitting alertly beside her, at Martha's encouraging nod, at Pete's weathered hands folded in quiet support, at Jake's defiant loyalty, and at Sarah's carefully guarded hope. I pinky promise, he said solemnly, extending his hand toward Emma. She walked to the front of the room and linked her small finger with his, sealing a contract that felt more binding than any corporate agreement he had ever signed. Then I think we should vote, Emma announced with the authority of someone who had settled the matter conclusively. The vote wasn't even close. Mayor Henderson called for a show of hands from registered Seaside Harbor residents regarding whether Charles Wentworth should be welcomed as a permanent community member. The result was so overwhelming that several people laughed with surprise at the solidarity. 47 hands raised in support, 3 abstentions, and only 1 vote against Tom Henderson, who later explained that he wasn't opposed to Charles personally, but worried about the precedent of accepting wealthy outsiders without proper vetting procedures. But the real transformation happened after the vote, when people began approaching Charles, not with the deference he had grown accustomed to as a billionaire, but with the casual acceptance typically reserved for neighbors and friends. Charlie, you still planning to help with the school carnival next month? Asked Mrs. Peterson, Emma's teacher, treating him exactly the same as she had before learning his true identity. My fishing boat needs a new net, added Captain Rodriguez, owner of the Maria Elena. Pete says you're getting pretty good with repairs. What do you charge? Same as always, Charles replied, understanding that this was exactly the kind of test he needed to pass. Nothing for neighbors, just the cost of materials and maybe a beer when the work's done. Sarah approached him as the crowd began to disperse, her expression still guarded but no longer actively hostile. Walk me home? She asked quietly. They left the community center together, moving slowly through streets where porch lights created pools of warmth in the coastal darkness. Max trotted beside them, occasionally investigating interesting smells, but always returning to heel beside. Sarah with the loyalty of someone who understood that important conversations required canine supervision. I'm still angry, Sarah said when they were out of earshot of other residents. I know, Charles replied. You have every right to be. Do you really understand why I'm angry? Sarah stopped walking and turned to face him directly. It's not because you're wealthy, Charles. It's because you made me fall in love with someone who wasn't real. The words hit Charles with devastating accuracy. Charlie is real. Charlie is part of you, Sarah interrupted. But Charlie, without Charles, is incomplete. The man I was falling for was someone who seemed to understand struggle, who appreciated simple pleasures because he'd never had better options, who found meaning in small acts of service because that's all he could offer. Now I find out that every moment of financial worry I shared with you, every concern about the shelter's future, every time I chose to cook dinner at home instead of going out because money was tight, you were experiencing all of that through the filter of someone who could solve every problem with a phone call. Charles wanted to argue, to explain that money hadn't made the connections less meaningful or the service less genuine. But Sarah's pain demanded better than his defensive explanations. You're right, he said simply. I experienced your struggles as interesting challenges rather than real threats. I watched you worry about the shelter's finances while knowing I could fix everything, and I told myself I was being noble by not interfering instead of recognizing that I was being dishonest by not sharing the full truth of who I was. They resumed walking, their footsteps creating a rhythm that matched the distant sound of waves against the harbor breakwater.
"So where does that leave us?" Sarah asked.
"I don't know," Charles admitted. "I hope it leaves us with a chance to start over with complete honesty. I hope it means I can fall in love with who you really are while you decide whether you can fall in love with who I really am, wealth and all." Sarah was quiet for several blocks, processing his words with the careful consideration of someone whose heart had been bruised by too many disappointments. "The foundation you mentioned tonight," she said finally. "How would that actually work?" Charles felt a flutter of hope at her practical question. Sarah was thinking about futures instead of dwelling on past deceptions, which suggested she was at least willing to consider possibilities beyond immediate hurt and anger. A board of local residents would control all funding decisions, Charles explained. "I would contribute resources, but have no more voting power than any other community member. The goal would be to support existing organizations and initiatives rather than imposing outside priorities." "And you'd be satisfied with that?" "Not having control over how your money gets used." Charles thought about the question seriously. His entire business career had been built on maintaining control over resources and outcomes, minimizing risks through careful management of every variable he could influence. "I think," he said slowly, "that learning to trust other people's judgment might be exactly what I need to learn. I've spent decades believing that my success proved I knew better than everyone else how to manage money and make decisions. But you all have built something here that I couldn't create with all my wealth, a community where people take care of each other because that's what decent people do." They reached Sarah's cottage, where warm light glowed behind curtains that spoke of home in ways Charles's expensive apartments never had. "I need time," Sarah said, not unkindly but with the firmness of someone setting necessary boundaries. "I need time to figure out whether I can trust you again, and whether I can trust myself to see you clearly instead of through the lens of either idealization or disappointment." "I understand," Charles said, though the words felt inadequate for the complexity of emotions between them. "But Charles?" Sarah paused with her hand on the door handle. "Thank you for staying. Thank you for being brave enough to face the community directly instead of running away when things got complicated." After Sarah went inside, Charles walked home through streets that felt different now, not because the physical landscape had changed, but because his relationship with it had been transformed. He was no longer Charlie Walker, temporary volunteer hiding from his real identity. He was Charles Wentworth, permanent resident of Seaside Harbor, with all the opportunities and responsibilities that entailed. His cottage felt different, too. Instead of a temporary refuge from his real life, it had become the foundation for whatever came next. Tomorrow he would call his lawyers and begin the complex process of restructuring his financial life around permanent residence in a small Oregon coastal town. He would establish the community foundation with legal frameworks that ensured local control. He would figure out how to be wealthy without being isolated, generous without being controlling. But tonight, he sat on his porch and called the one person who deserved to hear his news directly. "Rebecca, it's Charles. I have some instructions for you about my permanent relocation to Seaside Harbor, Oregon." The long pause that followed was filled with the sound of his assistant processing information that overturned everything she thought she understood about her employer's priorities and plans. "Sir," Rebecca said finally, "are you absolutely certain about this decision?" Charles looked out at the harbor, where fishing boats rocked gently at their moorings, and security lights created golden reflections on dark water. In the distance, he could see Pete's boat, the Second Chance, waiting for tomorrow's dawn departure. The sight filled him with the same sense of rightness he had felt that first morning when Emma and Max had pulled him from drowning. "I've never been more certain about anything in my life," Charles said. "I'm home, Rebecca." Finally, after 76 years, I'm home. 6 months later, Charles stood on the same beach where Max had pulled him from the drowning waters, watching Emma practice her flower girl walk, while Max provided patient escort services during her rehearsal. Tomorrow would bring Charles and Sarah's wedding, a simple ceremony on the sand with folding chairs borrowed from the community center and flowers, arranged by Martha from her own garden. The ring in Charles's pocket wasn't the expensive symbol a billionaire was expected to provide. Instead, it was a simple gold band chosen together from Murphy's jewelry store on Main Street, where Ed Murphy had been crafting wedding rings for Seaside Harbor couples for 37 years. Ed had been more interested in hearing about their courtship than impressed by Charles's ability to afford platinum and diamonds. "Mr. Charlie," Emma called out, using the compromise name they had settled on after discovering that some habits were too precious to change completely. "Come watch Max practice walking slow. He keeps wanting to go rescue dog speed instead of wedding speed." Charles smiled at Emma's serious attention to ceremonial details. Over the past months, she had appointed herself wedding coordinator with the thoroughness of someone who understood that important events required proper planning. Her lists included everything from make sure Max's collar is clean to remind Grandma Martha to bring tissues for crying. The Wentworth Foundation had been officially established 4 months ago, with a board consisting of Martha, Pete, Sarah, Mayor Henderson, and 3 other longtime residents. Charles served as a non-voting member, contributing ideas and resources while learning to trust other people's judgment about community priorities. Their first major project had been the expansion of the animal shelter, funded not through Charles's unilateral decision, but through careful planning that involved multiple community meetings and transparent budget discussions. Jake had been hired as the shelter's first full-time youth coordinator, developing programs that paired at-risk teenagers with animals who needed socialization and training. His transformation from angry outsider to confident leader had become a model for similar initiatives in neighboring communities. Pete beamed with pride every time someone mentioned his nephew's success, though he pretended the recognition was mostly about Jake's natural talent rather than the older man's patient guidance. "Charles, could you help me with something?" Sarah's voice carried the easy familiarity of someone who had learned to trust again gradually, through daily evidence of consistency and honesty rather than grand gestures or elaborate promises. She emerged from the dunes carrying a large frame wrapped in brown paper, tomorrow's surprise for Charles, though he had been instructed to act appropriately amazed when she presented it during the ceremony. "Emma's been working on this with our class for weeks," Sarah explained, settling the frame against a piece of driftwood. "She wanted to give you something that showed how the town sees you now." Charles unwrapped the frame to reveal a collage of photographs and drawings depicting his life in Seaside Harbor. There was a photo of him working with Pete on net repairs, another showing him walking dogs at the shelter, and a candid shot of him helping Emma with homework while Max supervised from the kitchen floor. Emma had added her own artwork around the edges, drawings of rescue boats, golden retrievers, and people holding hands. At the center of the collage was the original Forbes magazine cover that had exposed his identity, but Emma had drawn over it with careful artwork that transformed the corporate portrait into something warmer. She had added a smile to the serious business expression, drawn Max sitting beside the suited figure, and written Mr. Charlie Walker Wentworth, Seaside Harbor hero, in her careful third-grade handwriting. She insisted on the hyphenated name. Sarah explained, watching Charles study Emma's artistic integration of his 2 identities. She said that way everyone would know you're both people at the same time. Charles felt his throat tighten with emotion at the 8-year-old's solution to his identity crisis. Emma had understood something that had taken him months to figure out. He didn't have to choose between being Charles and being Charlie. He could be both, integrating his resources and experience with his desire for authentic connection and meaningful contribution. Mr. Charlie. Emma appeared at his side, tugging on his flannel shirt with the authority of someone who had important information to share. Pete says the tide will be perfect tomorrow for the ceremony, and Grandma Martha says her apple pie is ready for the reception. And Sarah says you're probably nervous, but you shouldn't be because everyone already loves you. What do you think? Charles asked, kneeling to meet Emma's eyes. Should I be nervous? Emma considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, looking out at the harbor where fishing boats were returning from the day's work while gulls wheeled overhead in their eternal search for easy meals. Maybe a little nervous is okay, she said finally, because it means you care a lot about getting married to Sarah and staying here forever. But mostly you should be happy because Max approves of Sarah, and Max is never wrong about people. As if summoned by the mention of his name, Max padded over and sat beside Charles with the solid presence of someone who had appointed himself official wedding supervisor. The golden retriever's graying muzzle and slower gait showed his advancing age, but his eyes still held the intelligence and kindness that had made him a hero that first morning, when he chose to save a drowning stranger. Max wants to tell you something, Emma announced with the confidence of someone who served as official interpreter for her canine companion. He says he's proud of you for learning how to be rescued and how to rescue other people at the same time. Charles scratched behind Max's ears, remembering the moment when this remarkable dog had pulled him from the water and inadvertently saved his soul along with his body. In the months since, Charles had come to understand that rescue was not a single dramatic event, but an ongoing process of choosing connection over isolation, service over selfishness, and love over fear. The wedding the next day exceeded every expectation Charles had dared to harbor. The ceremony was simple, but perfect vows exchanged on sand still warm from afternoon sun, rings blessed by a minister who had known Sarah since childhood, and promises witnessed by a community that had voted to accept Charles, not because of his wealth, but because of his willingness to learn what it meant to belong somewhere. Emma performed her flower girl duties with the precision of someone who had rehearsed every step, while Max served as ring bearer with dignity that befitted his status as the hero whose rescue had made everything possible. Pete walked Sarah down the aisle in place of the father she had lost years earlier, his weathered face bright with the joy of someone giving away a daughter of choice rather than biology. Martha cried during the vows, just as Emma had predicted, while Jake took unofficial photographs that would eventually join Emma's collage as evidence of the family Charles had found in the most unlikely place. But the moment that would stay with Charles forever came during the reception, when the sun was setting over the Pacific and neighbors were dancing to music provided by the same folk trio that had played the Rescue Heroes Festival. Emma approached him with Max at her side, both wearing flower crowns that Martha had crafted from beach grass and late summer wildflowers. Mr. Charlie, Emma said solemnly, I have something important to tell you. What's that? You're officially adopted now, she announced. Grandma Martha says when you marry someone in the family, you become part of the whole family, not just married to one person. So now you're my uncle friend forever, even if you get grumpy or forget to help with homework sometimes. Charles knelt beside Emma and Max, looking out at the celebration where his chosen family danced and laughed while waves provided eternal accompaniment. The scene looked nothing like the life he had lived for 76 years. But it felt like everything he had been searching for without knowing how to find it. Thank you, he whispered, not sure whether he was speaking to Emma, to Max, to the community that had welcomed him, or to whatever force in the universe arranges for drowning billionaires to be rescued by golden retrievers and 8-year-old girls who believe everyone deserves someone to worry about them. You're welcome, Emma replied with the simple acceptance of someone who had never doubted that love was meant to be shared freely rather than hoarded. Carefully, as the evening wound down and guests began to drift home to houses that had become as familiar to Charles as his own cottage, Sarah slipped her hand into his, and led him back to the water's edge where their story had begun. "Any regrets?" she asked, looking out at stars beginning to appear over the darkening ocean. Charles thought about the empire he had abandoned, the corporate reputation he had sacrificed, and the isolation he had chosen to leave behind in favor of community. Membership that required vulnerability rather than control. "Just one," he said finally. Sarah tensed slightly, perhaps wondering if he was having second thoughts about the radical life change that had brought them to this moment. "I regret that it took me 76 years to learn what wealth really means." Charles continued, "I regret all the time I wasted accumulating money instead of accumulating moments like this." Sarah relaxed against his side, her wedding dress trailing in sand that still held the day's warmth. "Well," she said practically, "you can't change the first 76 years, but you get to decide what to do with whatever years come next." Charles kissed his wife while waves lapped at their feet, and Max dozed contentedly on the beach where he had once saved a drowning stranger and inadvertently saved a man's soul. In the distance, lights from Seaside Harbor twinkled like earthbound stars, marking the boundaries of the place Charles would call home for the rest of his life. He had finally learned the difference between having everything and having enough. Everything had made him miserable and isolated. Enough had given him love, purpose, and the kind of wealth that could never be stolen or lost or diminished by sharing it freely with others. The man who had nearly drowned that foggy morning 6 months ago had been searching for something to acquire. The man who stood on this beach tonight had found something to protect and nurture and call home. Max stirred from his nap and padded over to lean against Charles's legs with the satisfied weight of someone whose work was complete, but whose presence would always be needed. The golden retriever had saved more than one life that morning. He had saved the possibility of connection itself, proving that sometimes the most profound rescues happen not when we pull someone from the water, but when we pull someone back into the current of human love. Charles Wentworth had spent decades building an empire. Charlie Walker had spent months building a life. Tonight, they were the same person, finally whole.